Any trip to Europe can feel like a trip back in time. There's a rich history to relish at almost every turn. Our trip across the North Atlantic did not disappoint. When we booked our trip, the departure point was Portsmouth, England. We made hotel reservations accordingly to arrive a few days early, making sure no flight hiccups caused us to miss our ship. That also gave us time to spend a quiet Friday exploring the historic town of Portsmouth. On the south coast of England, Portsmouth dates back to Roman times, but many start its history in the 1100s, when a wealthy Norman merchant gave land to some monks to build a chapel. It was dedicated to Thomas Becket. It eventually became the Church of St. Thomas of Canterbury and is now commonly called the Portsmouth Cathedral. The church loomed large throughout the city's story of survival. During the 100 Years' War of the 1300s, the French destroyed much of Portsmouth, sparing the house of worship. After sailors murdered the bishop in the 1400s, it was closed for more than a half-century. During the English Civil War in the 1600s, the royal forces used the church tower to watch the enemy. The town of Portsmouth and its naval base grew right alongside the church. The king had the first Portsmouth dock built in 1194. The fortified seawalls started going up around 800 years ago. Many locate the world's first sally port in one of those seawalls just a few steps from the square tower. These were some of the first stone fortifications built in the city. It's now a backdrop for a public beach. The square tower once stored as much as 6,000 barrels of gunpowder. Now, it's used as a venue for music concerts, weddings, and other events. The Spinnaker Observation Tower dominates the harbor landscape. It's a landmark for ships passing by entering the English Channel. Next to the Spinnaker sits the HMS Warrior, a 40-gun steam-powered armored frigate. It was the pride of the Royal Navy in the late 1800s. It was declared obsolete only about 20 years after it was built. Today, it's a restored museum ship. Just around the corner is a historic roadway, the Queen's Way, named for Queen Anne following her visit in 1711. The wall was built the same year. History. Lots of history. Portsmouth was a pit stop. Our ship's departure point had been switched to Southampton, about 20 miles north up the Southampton waters. We got there and counted at least 6 other cruise liners loading to leave the port, with an average of 3,000 passengers and another 1,000 crew on each vessel. That's 24,000 people or more headed somewhere. Southampton was a busy place. After we sailed into the English Channel, our first stop was Edinburgh, Scotland. The boat anchored off the New Haven docks, and many of the 2,000-plus passengers rode lifeboats and transfer craft ashore. While waiting for buses to arrive, we walked over to a department store and discovered it was, until recently, owned by Walmart. They still own 10% of the company stock, but we didn't spot any yellow asterisk anywhere. Our tour buses gave us a windshield tour of Old Town, Lawn Market, High Street, Canongate, and the new Scottish Parliament building. Back in the early 90s, when we drove to Edinburgh, there weren't dense crowds bumping into each other. Now, tour buses were stacked everywhere near the Royal Mile leading up to the Edinburgh Castle, where Mary, Queen of Scots, gave birth to King James VI of Scotland. He became King James I of England, the king that tried to arrest the Pilgrims before they ran off to Holland and eventually America. Built on an extinct volcano, the Edinburgh Castle has towered over the city as a royal residence for more than 1,000 years. In the 1600s, it was mainly used as a military garrison. It's been many things: a treasury, a mint, a prison, and a museum. It's been under siege more than 24 times and played a role in historical conflicts, like the Wars of Scottish Independence and the Jacobite Rising in 1745. As we arrived, a huge temporary grandstand was being built around the castle entrance. This would hold nearly 9,000 spectators for the annual military tattoo that was held during several weeks in August. From the cannon position on the castle walls, the iconic skyline of the city is punctuated by places like Calton Hall, St. Andrew's and St. George's Church West, the National and Nelson monuments, the former North British Hotel, and the Scott Monument dedicated to Sir Walter Scott. We were told the guards we saw were not there throughout the year. They post them only during the time the Queen is at the palace and during the Lord Commissioner's Week. Once back on the ship, we sailed all night to Inverness. Many departed the ship for the lake infamous for the land of the Loch Ness Monster. Our group went in the opposite direction. We exited the town along the Firth, traveling about 15 miles to Cawdor Castle. The 600-year-old ancestral home of the Campbells of Cawdor is the current home of Angelica Campbell, a horticulturalist and aristocrat. The gardens surrounding the castle are her canvas, and her artistry is superb. She's also the stepmother of the current 7th Earl of Cawdor, which makes him the 25th Thane of Cawdor, chief of the Campbell clan. The title is legendary in Scottish nobility, mentioned in one of the most famous stories in Western literature. According to legend, the Thane of Cawdor built the castle in the 1300s. He had a dream, telling him to load a donkey with gold and let it roam about the district for a day. Wherever the animal laid down in the evening is where he should build his castle. The donkey laid down under a holly tree, and that is where he built his fortress. At the base of the old Cawdor Tower in the castle today is that petrified holly tree. Also, inside the castle are rooms filled with furniture, portraits, and tapestries of the Campbell family. The castle is best known for its literary connection to Shakespeare's tragedy, Macbeth. In the story, the title character is called
He bade me from him call thee Thane of Cawdor.
The Thane of Cawdor. However, the events in the story don't align with historical facts. The castle is never mentioned by name, and it was reportedly built long after the life of the 11th century King Macbeth. Leaving the castle, we made about a 6-mile trek to Culloden Moor, a location memorialized for the last big battle on the British mainland. It was here in 1746 the rebel Jacobite army of about 6,000 men under Charles Edward Stuart lined up against some 7,000 British government forces. Stuart's army had spent about a year fighting to restore his family to the throne, and to this point was undefeated in battle. Researchers say in the span of about 30 minutes at Culloden Moor, about 1,500 Jacobites were killed, more than 370 Jacobites were captured, and some 120 were tried and executed for treason. Only 50 of the government forces were killed. Blue and red flags mark where the front lines of each army stood, and clan markers indicate the graves of the fallen. A wall was also built to remember those who fought and died there, with the stones representing soldiers. The stones protruding from the wall represents those who died at Culloden. After visiting such a somber place, it seemed appropriate that afternoon to have the ship serenaded by bagpipes as we left port. We spent a day at sea before we arrived in Bergen, Norway. Norway is sometimes called Europe's battery. It is one of the world's top hydropower producers and exports electricity to Britain, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, and Germany using top-shelf technology. The 450-mile-long North Sea Link is the longest high-voltage subsea cable in the world, carrying Norwegian electricity to England. The cable connection starts not too far south of Bergen. As our ship navigated the Norwegian barrier islands, headed to the cruise port, we passed a submarine. It seemed apropos since the Nazis used Bergen as a major German U-boat base during World War II. When they were run off, Bergen became a main base for the Norwegian Navy and the home for its half-dozen or so submarines. From Bergen's docks, we headed to the third largest fjord on the planet, the Hardangerfjord. Our 7-hour bus ride took us through downtown Bergen, past Bergen House Fortress that houses King Haakon's Hall and the Rosencrantz Tower. Bergen's history is marked by more than a dozen huge fires that destroyed much of the city. The worst was in 1702, when 90% of the city was reduced to ashes. In 1916, 300 downtown buildings were destroyed, and in 1955, parts of the Bergen district burned. As we made our way along the Bjornfjord to our ferry, we could see the islands and snow-capped mountains in the distance. The land in this part of Norway resembles jigsaw puzzle pieces separated by waterways. We crossed several of them to reach the Hardangerfjord, where our scenic drive traveled along the waterway. Our guide pointed out several salmon farms along the route. At least 100 licensed farms in the fjord produce 70,000 tons of salmon a year. After leaving the Hardangerfjord to return to Bergen, we stopped at the Stenstal waterfall. We walked up the cliff to go behind the roaring water, crashing down more than 150 feet. Our bus also went by Oster Island, covering more than 125 square miles. It's Northern Europe's largest inland island. The next stop on our North Atlantic adventure was Alesund, Norway. Here, another bus and ferry ride took us about 40 miles away to the ski resort of Mount Stranda. Since it was May, we saw no skiers there, but many vacationers reportedly come up for a few days' respite in the hundreds of vacation homes. Some of those homes retained a natural wood color. We were told the newer ones must be painted black to better blend into the landscape and not distract from the rocky splendor. Some were also covered with traditional Scandinavian sod roofs. These roofs have a birch bark base that's covered with dirt, grass, weeds, and even trees if they're left unattended. While they provide ample insulation from the cold winters, the roofs needed to be routinely mowed or trimmed in the summer. The Vikings used such roofs, and perhaps others before them. After riding the gondola to the top of Stranda, we took in the picturesque view from high above Fjord. Snow was piled in places as high as our heads. Also from our perch, we could see the Jostedal Glacier, the largest ice sheet on continental Europe. While a sight to behold, the fjord is in constant danger of an eroding mountain that many fear will eventually collapse into the waterway, creating a tsunami. The waves could threaten 2 towns along the banks of the fjord. From Ålesund, we traveled about 140 miles west to Scotland. We landed in the archipelago known as Shetland, the northernmost point in the UK. The Shetland Islands were formed as a mountain range when the continents collided about 600 million years ago. Today, those mountains have become about 100 islands, but only about 16 are inhabited. Humans have lived on the archipelago for more than 7,000 years. The earliest settlers are believed to have been the Picts, a name given them by the Romans. These Picts left behind many structures scattered about Shetland and Scotland. It's thought they built more than 500 brochs, or round towers, in the Shetland region. The largest still standing is on an uninhabited island. We docked in Lerwick, on the southernmost large island in the chain. There are about 22,000 people living on the islands, alongside about 6 times that number of sheep. About 20 years ago, there were almost 3 times that many sheep. Unfortunately, only about 20% of the sheep are the native Shetland breed, which is now considered endangered. Shetland sheep are known for their fine wool, a proud product of the region. The isolation of the Shetland Islands created many distinct breeds beyond sheep. Likely the most popular is the Shetland pony, first used for pulling carts, carrying peat, and plowing land. Many ponies spent their lives in coal mines in Britain and the U.S., pulling coal carts until about 25 years ago. The islands also produced Shetland sheepdogs, Shetland cattle, pigs, geese, and ducks. Common words in the description of each Shetland breed are small and hardy. Our tour bus took us along 25 miles of winding roads, past the rolling peat-covered fields in the countryside. More than half of Shetland is covered in peat bogs, harvested and burned for fuel to heat homes. The bogs are also a rich wildlife habitat and food for the sheep herds. Since much of our route was along the coast, the vistas were spectacular. One of the Pix settlements was Jarlshof, on the southern tip of Shetland. This prehistoric village dates back perhaps 5,000 years and was occupied as late as the 1600s, after Earl Patrick built the old Sumbaugh house there. During the millennia, the settlement grew as layer upon layer of soil covered the land. Some early houses were abandoned, and later ones were built on top of them after time covered them with dirt. Eventually, sand from the nearby dunes covered the entire abandoned site, and it was forgotten until storms crashed waves onto the shores in the 1890s. This uncovered the village, and archaeologists carried out excavations during the next 60 years, uncovering the remarkable structures that overlook the bay that empties into the North Atlantic. Our ship spent the next day crossing those waters, passing the Faroe Islands before dropping anchor in the harbor of Seyðisfjörður, Iceland. Humanity has hardly touched East Iceland. Less than 4% of the Icelandic people live there. The small town of Seyðisfjörður is nestled at the end of an 8-mile fjord, considered one of the most beautiful in Iceland. The channel is surrounded by mountains standing more than a half-mile high, streaked with waterfalls. Those hillsides proved disastrous a few years back. Heavy rains caused a series of mudslides that destroyed more than 36 homes in this town of just about 700 people. They've since erected huge berms to try and redirect any future earthen slides away from the quaint town. We hiked the waterfall trail a few miles outside of town. Climbing the foothills of those mountains, we ascended about 500 feet, passing waterfall after magnificent waterfall, paying heed to the Arctic terns ready to dive bomb us if we ventured too close to their nest. Actually, it was only the tallest among us who were likely to be targeted by the angry birds. Our guide told those folks to stoop if the birds attacked. Arctic terns fly to Iceland to breed, and then fly south to Antarctica, only to return a year later. The 44,000-mile round trip makes the Arctic terns one of the longest migrating birds on the planet. Maybe that explains their tenacity to protect their nest. Despite its small size, Seyðisfjörður hosts cruise ships almost daily during the summer seasons, sometimes 2 ships per day. The town's port schedule for July 2024 included 27 ships. 10 years ago, they saw perhaps 1 ship per week. Each ship must make its way around a ring in the harbor that is in place to protect the fjord from oil leaking out of a sunken World War II British tanker. The ship was sunk by Nazi warplanes. While tourism has become Seyðisfjörður's biggest industry, Iceland is one of the many countries trying to reduce tourism that accounts for more than 8% of the nation's gross domestic product. To preserve that income, they plan to hike tourism taxes, making it more expensive to visit the already expensive country. They reinstated the so-called tourism tax at the start of this year, hiking hotel rooms by more than $4 a day and adding costs to campsites, mobile homes, and cruise ships. The tax was suspended during the COVID years. Despite having a tiny economy, Iceland's per capita GDP is 12th highest in the world, at more than $69,000 per person. The ship had to cross the Arctic Circle to make it to the next fjord we would traverse to arrive in Akureyri. The Ísafjörður is billed as Iceland's longest fjord, with Akureyri near its end. Our guide told us they've adopted special traffic lights to try to brighten the dark days the city's inhabitants endure during the long winters, when the sun sets about 3 hours after it rises. In the summer, the nights are only a few hours long. Our visit to Akureyri included an epic excursion to the diverse areas just a few hours' drive from the city. Our first stop was around Lake Mývatn, where volcanically formed craters rise out of the landscape. These were not magma vents, but remnants of gas explosions that occurred when boiling lava flowed over these cool, wet surfaces some 2,300 years ago. Magma's still not too far underground here, heating the water pools at the nature baths a mile or so away. Several industrial sites around the region also use this heat, harvesting the hot water underground and piping it to communities to heat homes and businesses. This is common throughout Iceland, with the hot pipes heating anything that can use it, including athletic fields to keep them clear of snow in the winter, pools, and community hot tubs that are social gathering places for Icelanders year-round. The hot tub political debates are a favorite pastime, fueled by geothermal heating. Our next stop was the lava field known as the Dark Fortress. The arches and pillars of rock formed from lava that flowed over the lake more than 2,000 years ago, cooling quickly and creating sometimes freakish formations. Icelandic folklore says some of these formations are trolls that turned to stone when they were caught out in the sunlight. Other stories say that lava caves were the homes of trolls. Trolls play a huge role in many Icelandic legends, as do elves. Estimates are about 8% of Icelanders are certain elves exist, while 45% believe that it is likely or possible that elves still roam the land. Since the days of the Vikings, Icelanders have embraced fantastic tales of their strange encounters with many peculiar supernatural beings with which they share the land. For example, the coming of the Yule lads marks the start of the Christmas season. These 13 brothers, who are direct descendants of trolls, live in the dark, deep caves in the mountains alongside their ogre parents and the child-devouring Yule cat. There are many more such tales in the country's folklore. From the lava formations, we could see the massive volcanic crater of Kafrafidal nearby. It erupted about 45,000 years ago, spewing magma and ash all over the region. The sharp rim of the crater is just more than a half-mile across. Our 8-hour trip was filled with very disparate destinations. One stop was an alien-like landscape surrounding the Namaskard mud pits. Here, fumaroles and mud pools release steam, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide constantly through the holes that reach deep into the earth. The ground felt soft and spongy under our feet, a real creepy feeling. Vents hissed all around us, and the mud pits boiled and splattered like a pot of thick soup. The fumes make the ground acidic and unfit to support practically any plant or animal life. It was a reminder that Iceland was formed on piles of lava that began rising between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates a mere 16 to 18 million years ago. That's quite young in geological terms. Those tectonic plates are slowly drifting apart about an inch each year, creating a rift that runs right through this desolate valley and across the entire country. Where the plates separate, magma rises, sometimes to the surface. Iceland is one of the most volcanically active areas on Earth. It averages a volcanic event once every 4 years, with about 130 active and inactive volcanoes. There's been 60 Icelandic volcano eruptions in the last 100 years. And more than 500 confirmed in the last 10,000 years. After the lava cools, our guide said it takes perhaps 500 years for the lichens and moss to begin to grow on the rocks, and after that, it could take 1 million years for soil to actually develop. From a land that could be used as a backdrop for a movie about life on Mars, we traveled to something completely different, Godafoss, the waterfall of the gods. Here, the waters of the Skavantafjord River cascade over the 100-foot-wide horseshoe-shaped cliffs, falling some 40 to 50 feet into the pool below. It's estimated that more than 100,000 gallons of water falls over the cliffs every second. Our third stop in Iceland was Ísafjörður, a small town of about 2,600, hosting at least 2 cruise ships that day, making the number of tourists in port far more than the locals. Ísafjörður is another pristine region of the country, located between the fingers of land on the Westfjords Peninsula. Towering mountains surrounded us that contained many one-way tunnels we had to transit. If we met oncoming traffic, there were underground pullouts for our bus to use to let the other traffic pass. Luckily, there wasn't much traffic. We wound our way through the valleys more than 35 miles to reach Dynjandi Waterfall, a bridal veil cascade at the end of the Artartfjordur Fjord. At Dynjandi, the water falls more than 300 feet down a staircase of lava rock layers. The whole cascade, from crest to the fjord, is 6 separate waterfalls, creating an awesome, thundering spectacle. While we were there, about 8 busloads of tourists were taking it all in. More were arriving as we left. Icelanders are very proud of their scenic country and its history. That's why they still speak the Norse language of the Vikings. Like other Nordic countries, they're also very protective of native breeds. They refuse to allow outside livestock to enter the country to protect the integrity of the breeds of Icelandic cattle, chickens, goats, pigs, and sheep. Icelandic horses have been protected by strict import laws for more than 1,000 years. Our guide told us if one ever left the island, it's never allowed to return. Throughout history, Iceland has reportedly also been very selective of who can and cannot come to its shores. For example, in 1615, some Basque whalers shipwrecked in the Westfjords region. When a few of them stole some dried fish, the entire group of 32 were killed, and a magistrate made it a law that any Basque seen in the region should also be killed. This law stayed on the books until just 9 years ago. And then there was the ruthless Eric the Red, the Viking banished from Norway and Iceland for murder, who later helped colonize nearby Greenland. His son, the most famous Icelandic Viking, Leif Erikson, sailed even further west to become the first European to reach North America. It wasn't until 1944 that Iceland became independent of Denmark after nearly a century-long struggle to break away. Even today, they don't maintain a military to protect themselves. Instead, they rely on NATO and a defense treaty with the United States to ward off any potential attackers. One of our many guides explained typical Icelanders do little planning, living life day to day, never knowing if a brutal winter storm, an avalanche, or a volcano could suddenly wipe out their homes, villages, or their lives. But Iceland's dangers go far beyond the island. Take, for example, the 1783 eruption of the volcano Loki. It caused a famine that killed about 25% of the Icelandic people. It also wiped out about 6 million others as temperatures dropped around the globe. Haze from the eruption lasted 8 months and was seen from Iceland to Syria. The sulfur dioxide spewed into the air caused crop failures in Europe and droughts in India. Even Benjamin Franklin wrote about it. I doubt Franklin ever saw the Westfjords. This isolated outcropping today is volcanically inactive. It's the oldest part of Iceland's landmass, but the deep valleys sheltering tiny towns creates scenery beyond description. While we were there, news broke that the volcanic fissure in Grindavik had begun erupting again. The nearby Blue Lagoon, that many in our group planned to visit, had been closed by the eruption. Luckily, the international airport just 25 miles away remained open, so we would be able to leave. Our last stop was not far from there, in the capital of Reykjavik. It has almost 4 times the population of any other municipality in Iceland. It is also considered the 5th most over-touristed city in the world. Ronald Reagan met Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik for their nuclear arms summit in 1986. They could not come to an agreement at the Hofti House. We visited the Perlin Museum with its panoramic vistas available from the rotating cafe on top. We stopped at the Hallgrímskirkja church that was packed with tourists, making it feel more like a bus station than a church. Several buses were parked on the street beside the towering structure. Likely the most dramatic event for us was when our tour bus took us to the airport. To the east, we could see the red-hot lava boiling out of the Grindavik fissure. After we picked up our rental car at the airport and we headed back to our hotel by the lake in Korpafur, we stopped at a roadblock as close as we could get to the eruption. We were about 5 miles away, but you could still see the sulfurous haze and the lava spitting into the air. After a day at our hotel, we passed by this area again, headed to the airport at Keflavik. In just 36 hours, you could see the lava had piled dramatically higher. The land of fire and ice, truly an amazing place like none other we've ever seen. Iceland is a true jewel in the North Atlantic.